So I do want to just share a little bit about Adena. Many of you may know her. She is living in the Valley, you said, since the 70s, correct?
Yes.
But I'm going to share a little bit about her. She can, Adena, you can fill in whatever else I'm missing. But Adena has worked as a government attorney for over 15 years. She has taught Sunday school at her temple for 8 years. And in her last 2 years, she co-taught a class on the Holocaust studies. As a writer, she regularly contributes articles to Mask magazine. Recently, she recognized that her professional and philanthropic work with, she was recognized, for her professional and philanthropic work with an award, which was called the Amazing Woman Award from the Phoenix Suns and National Bank of Arizona. And she is the mother of 3 very active teenagers. And one of the things that she has done is she wrote a book that was the story about her grandmother's Holocaust survival. And this is what she'll be speaking about today. It's a book that you can find online on many different platforms. The book is called Living Among the Dead, My Grandmother's Holocaust Survival Story of Love and Strength. And we're very honored to have you here today. The book itself, just so many of you may know, I included this in the email, is a 2020 Reader's Favorite Gold Medal winner in the nonfiction biography genre. So it's been recognized by others as a very important and good read. And thank you for joining us today to talk about it and answer questions afterwards. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Let me try to share my screen again.
Perfect.
All right, is that working? Oh, perfect. Okay, great. Yeah, so thank you for having me. That's a cover of my book. It did just win this award. I didn't even know it was nominated. So I was really surprised and really happy to see that. It's been a bestseller in 4 different categories on Amazon, and several school districts here in Maricopa County have actually picked it up to be part of their curriculum, which I'm also just very honored by. I always like to start off by thanking anyone that wants to spend some time with me and listen to my story or the story of my grandmother. I always feel very privileged and honored to talk about her story of survival. It obviously helps me feel close to her. And I also think it serves a very important purpose of keeping their memories alive and preserving their legacies. And obviously we know that with the uptick in anti-Semitism and hate crimes, we want to do our part to never forget so that this never happens again. And as Rabbi just mentioned, I have been a prosecutor with the Maricopa County Attorney's Office for, I think it's closer to 18 years now. I handle foreign extradition cases for my office. I did teach Sunday school. I haven't done it this past year and a half, just because life with my teenagers has gotten very busy. I do have 3 of them. 2 are juniors at Chaparral High School, and 1 attends the online platform through ASU Prep Digital. I did write the story of my grandmother's survival that came out this past March. And Phoenix Holocaust Association asked me to be on their board, which I said yes to, and I've been serving as a board member this year. And so we already talked about that. And so I've always felt, very close to my grandmother. That's a picture of us probably in Montreal or nearby. When I was little, I am the oldest granddaughter. And even though my English name, as you know, is Adena, my 2 Hebrew names are named after my grandmother's sisters. Their names were Rivka and Nechamka. My grandmother was the youngest of 3 girls, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And her entire family perished in the Holocaust. And so when I was born, my mother and father gave me the names Rivka and Nechama after my grandmother's sisters. And I think in part being named after them has made me have this close connection to them. And growing up, as you'll see throughout the presentation, I was always very close physically and emotionally to my grandmother. And so growing up, I always noticed this presence of absence on my grandmother's side. My father's side was always very large. In fact, I have so many cousins on his side that there's 11 cousins. And my cousin Jeff, who lives in Israel, always calls me number 9. He'll send me an email and it will start off, "Hey, number 9, how are you?" Because there's just so many of us. And on my grandmother's side, or my mother's side, there were no cousins for a very long time. And, as you get to, you grow up and you learn about the Holocaust in school and at home. My grandmother was very open, but it was always very hard to ask her questions. If you ever worked with victims, you know that the trauma that they re-experience when talking about the event is very difficult. My grandmother would not sleep for 1 to 2 weeks. So I had to be very careful with my questions. And also, even though I've been a prosecutor for my entire professional life, no matter what question I asked, it always seemed to be difficult for her to answer. Maybe it was a bad question. Maybe what I thought was a simple question really wasn't. But it was, always a tricky thing to ask. And so writing the book really helped me put everything sort of in one place for her. What I love about my book, and the reason I wrote it, and I think why it's doing so well, is because my grandmother was a beautiful poet. She wrote in a lot in English, even though that was her sixth language. She also wrote a little bit in Yiddish, her first language, which Rabbi Levertov helped me translate. And she also wrote in Polish. But what I decided to do was gather up all of her writings, really just to have copies of them that I could put in one place for my children. But then it became a bigger project. I thought, well, how are they going to understand this if they don't understand the historical context? She was interviewed as part of the Shoah Foundation project, so I watched the interviews. So as you could see, it snowballed from just wanting to copy her poetry into what ended up being this book, which was my first version of this book. It was self-published, and I put it on Amazon. I actually worked with the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. After they made sure I was who I said I was and, not some crazy person. They gave me their banking information, which I gave to Amazon, and every penny that book made went directly routed to the museum, not through me. And then about 2 years ago, I was at an author event with my son. He writes science fiction, and somebody came up to me that had read my book and said, you really should look at getting this published. It's so good, and you could reach a wider audience. And so then it became a whole rewrite and so forth. But this past March, Amsterdam publishers published it. Right before the self-published book came out, though, I brought a copy over to my grandmother. That was taken right after the book was self-published and a month before she passed away. And a lot of people ask from this picture, the title of the book, as you can see, Mother of Souls. They always ask, how did you come up with that name? I had looked up what her name meant in a dictionary online. I don't know how real it is or not, but I saw that her name, Mania, meant Mother of Souls. And I thought, well, that's just perfectly fitting. And so that is why I titled the first book that. Of course, the publisher changed the name for the published book. And so anyways, getting started. My grandmother in 1995, she started doing a lot of writing around that time, and she wrote this: as a survivor of the Holocaust, I am very often asked this question: how did you survive? Indeed, how? I, the youngest of the family, shy and insecure, far from being brave, I could answer it with one word: fate. I was meant to survive 3 pogroms, which eliminated the town's about 26,000 Jews. And so this is a picture of my grandmother's parents, Ghetto, which is her mother's name in Yiddish, or Katya in Russian, and her father was Gershon, and the married name is Tish. He was a pharmacist. And my grandmother was born in December of 1922. And if you remember that, I'm pointing it out so that hopefully you'll remember December of 1922. You'll see she, at the end, she ends up assuming a completely different birthday because of the Holocaust, like many other survivors. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, she was the youngest of 3 girls. And that's just another picture of her parents. I love how formal people posed back then. They didn't have the digital cameras and the smartphones where they take 60 pictures of the same image. It's one beautiful photo, but I love how formal it is. And she told me that she had, having 2 older sisters, having sisters makes you important and makes you belong somewhere. And that's back then, that is really what her identity was being one of her sister's sister. And this is a picture also. My grandmother's mother's on the very left. My grandmother's the baby sitting in her lap. Her oldest sister, Rivka, is the child in the middle with the hat on. Her sister, Nechamka, is on the back right with the white bow, and her father, Gershon, is sitting in the chair on the right. And so she came from a medium-sized city. It was very cultural for its time. It was called Włocławek, which was in Poland. It's now part of the Ukraine. There were 2 gymnasiums there, which are the equivalent to our high schools, and 7 elementary schools. And she lived in the same neighborhood with other Jews. And I think I mentioned there were about 26,000 in her city. They settled wherever they were permitted to, since our homeland of Israel had not been born yet. And inside the home, her family spoke Yiddish, and outside the home, she learned Polish. And this is a photograph of her town, Włocławek. I got this photograph actually from when I did a lot of the research for my book. The Yad Vashem in Israel put me in touch with a childhood friend of my grandmother's. I couldn't believe it. Unfortunately, the woman lives in Israel. She only speaks Hebrew and Yiddish, and I don't speak either of those. And as it just turned out, it being a very small world, I have a college friend from ASU who was living in Israel at the time. And so she could speak fluent Hebrew, and she went to this woman's house, I think 3 times in total, to ask her questions. And this woman had visited the hometown back in 2000 and took some photographs that she sent me copies of. And this was also from that same visit from that same woman. I got a picture of my grandmother's school. And back then the schools were divided into 4 quadrants, boys and girls, and Jewish and Christian. And so the playground of the Jewish girls' school shared the same fence as the Christian boys' school. And my grandmother told me that Christian boys were often spitting at the Jewish girls or throwing soda cans at them. However, she said nobody told anybody in charge, because culturally anti-Semitism was unfortunately accepted and permitted. And then later, through the research that I did for my book, I learned that those boys were actually part of the Hitler Youth. My grandmother spent her days like many other children without a lot of means, playing with other children. They read a lot of books, which is why I think my grandmother was able to learn different languages so easily and was just such an amazing poet. They went skating outside. And I remember she talked about they made out of cardboard like a makeshift sled, and they would, take that and slide down the hills. But the one thing they did own, which was considered a luxury item, was a radio. And my grandmother would say that every Wednesday evening, the Bulgarian transmission played these beautiful songs on the hit parade. And my grandmother would teach all the kids at school the next day the songs that she had learned the night before. And they would sing in Polish and Russian and Yiddish, and she knew all the popular songs from listening to them on the radio. They also had a garden, which my grandmother loved. And I mean, even till the day she passed away, she would talk about the garden and some of the wildflowers there. They grew a lot of different vegetables, and they had cherry and apple trees that I remember her father tended. And they also had these unique flowers in her native land called gwoździki. That's the Polish name. It carried a perfume scent and was very colorful, and it's very much like what we know as carnations. And so I'd like to just read you a brief poem that my grandmother wrote on March 1st of 2000 called Our Magic Garden. There once was a magic garden, through my childish eyes most ideal, where the early spring's warm sun on my face I still can feel. Never a very sound sleeper, I was up with the tweeting of the birds. The rhapsodic loud sound had told me that they too were glad to be there. I still can smell the aroma that exuded from the rainbow of colors. I watched it like a mother and baby, from the first spurts to full-grown flowers. That magic spot was our garden, that Eden I'll never forget, and never, never shall I see it again, except through the eyes of my mind. And so, as we know, Hitler's initial rise to power was in 1933. It really did not affect my grandmother at all. Plus, she told me absolutely no one believed that the Nazi regime would be so bad. But in 1938, they could start hearing him more on the radio, and they heard the word union being used a lot. And around the same time, there was also this film at her sister's school that involved a girl getting a Jewish girl getting a gift from a Christian boy. and it was a box, and then she'd unwrap the box, there'd be another box inside, and she'd unwrap that to a smaller box, and so on, until at the very smallest box held an onion. And this was like a big gag gift, a form of anti-Semitism, my grandmother said. And they also started to notice the increase in anti-Semitism in their town as well. In September of 1939, my grandmother was 17, and she said the Germans invaded her town. They came in on motorcycles, and a bomb was released, killing my grandmother's best friend, the best friend's father, and the younger sibling. But after 3 days, a deal was made between the Nazis and Stalin. And so now my grandmother lived under Russian control. This is where she really learned Russian very well. And so she spoke that in addition to Yiddish and Polish. And she lived under Russian control from 1939 into 1941. She attended a Russian school, and she told me, in all honesty, things were really not so bad for her, because the Russians loved music and loved to dance, and so did my grandmother. And so this kind of worked out in that she was able to do some things that she otherwise wasn't able to. However, there were no more private enterprises, and so her father's pharmacy got taken away, and he was sent to a neighboring city to work in a pharmacy there. And she also recalled Jews that were sent away to Siberia, never to be seen again. Also during this time, my grandmother's sister Rivka got married. Her husband was forced to enlist, and he was never seen again. In 1941, the ghettos began, and my grandmother's city was captured. It was enclosed by barbed wire, and all Jews were forced to register. They were then administered a white armband with a Star of David that they had to wear on their arms. 2 ghettos at this time were also created, the Living Ghetto and the Dead Ghetto. Of course, the Nazis did not call it by these names because they didn't want to instill any fear in the Jews, but everyone knew which ghetto was which and which ones they lived in. All valuables had to be released, including their radio, and anyone who disobeyed the order was shot. My grandmother said that their Shabbat candlesticks were taken in June of 1941, and she wrote, "To give up one's candlestick, an inheritance which remained in families for generations and were without fail lit every Friday night, was a distinct sign of destruction of the Jewish home." My grandmother told me that hunger soon became a major problem because the existing food supply became exhausted and additional food was not being provided, but trading would take place between the poles. They would look to exchange a potato or a piece of bread for something valuable. And again, as you remember, my grandmother's father was a pharmacist. They had a lot of scented powder that they used back then, and so he brought home a lot of that they were using in exchange for food. So the Living Ghetto in my grandmother's hometown was larger than the Dead Ghetto, and those that were allowed to live there had to have a trade or a skill that was deemed valuable by the Nazis. No one was permitted to leave the ghetto except for to perform forced labor. She said soon those white armbands were replaced with the 5-inch bright orange and yellow patches that covered their front and back. My grandmother also learned that one of those graves was to hold 19,000 people, and the second grave was to hold thousands more. She told me that she sat around with her sisters crying, and they were a musical threesome, and so they would sing songs to help pass the time, but they were constantly hungry. It was always cold because there was no heat. They did live in a constant state of fear, and they would just dream of being free. They knew how to knit, and so they would often, just to help pass the time, unravel sweaters and then re-knit them. And she did tell me about Rivka's sweater that she would watch her sister, knit. It had this beautiful intrinsic design on it. And I think, being the youngest of 3, my grandmother really looked up to Rivka, and anything Rivka had, she really adored. And she wrote beautiful passages about both of her sisters, which are in my book, and she very much did look up to them. So as I mentioned, only those that had skills or trades could live in the Living Ghetto, and you needed a card to prove it. My grandmother's father, as you know, was a pharmacist, And so that wasn't very helpful to the Nazis, but through some connections, he was able to get a card listing him as a bricklayer, even though he had never laid a brick in his life. But because of that, they were allowed to stay in their home. And that was great news for them because it was already situated in the living ghetto. Approximately 26,000 Jews were brought in from surrounding towns. They were crammed into these two small ghettos. And so all kinds of families were moved into my grandmother's house, and each room was occupied by a different family. And as we know from stories from other survivors, they tried very hard to keep up with the Jewish holidays. It was very difficult at times, but that's what we do to keep the traditions alive. My grandmother said that in August of 1942, it was harvest time and 500 women were taken to work in the wheat field. And this included my grandmother. They were making flour from the wheat and they were working very long hours. She said that they were supervised by a man on a horse who would whip them if they weren't working fast enough. And once my grandmother was whipped by this man on the horse and she felt very demeaned, but there was just nothing you could do about it. You had to just keep working. So the first 2 days in the wheat fields, they were given 1 cup of soup and 1 small drink of water. But on the 3rd day, they weren't given anything. And I asked my grandmother if she knew why. And she said they'd all just assumed that they were going to be murdered soon. And so the Nazis figured, why waste any food on the soon to be dead? But when she got back to their house, my grandmother's grandmother, Henya, gave my grandmother this little pickle, a little sour pickle that someone had given to her. And my grandmother really talked about this little pickle being such a symbol of love and true heroism. So the last day in the wheat field, 3 trucks came and brought the women from the wheat field at the end of the day back to the Dead Ghetto. And as you might recall, my grandmother was living in the living ghetto. And she cried to them and pleaded, please let me go back to the living ghetto. But of course, they laughed at her and they didn't care. So when she got to the Dead Ghetto, she found Rivka's in-laws. So her sister's in-laws were there in the Dead Ghetto and a cousin named Popa. Popa was 14 years old at the time, and Popa will remain with us for the rest of the story. So just wanted to mention that now. And so my grandmother with her sister's in-laws and Popa stayed up all night, fully clothed. They knew something was about to happen. And at dawn on September 1st of 1942 at 6 a.m., they were surrounded by the Nazis and the Ukrainians with their automatic rifles. They entered into the Dead Ghetto, and my grandmother ran to a hiding place with Rivka's in-laws. Now, the 3rd floor of the house where they were was occupied by a prominent family, and the back wall contained an armoire which slid open, and a secret entrance to an attic was behind it. And so that is where my grandmother ran to with most of Rivka's in-laws, including Popa, the cousin. But unfortunately, Popa's mother and Popa's 2 younger siblings did not make it up into the attic, and they could hear them being taken away and screaming and crying. In the attic, my grandmother hid for 15 days. She said it was extremely hot because of the tin roof, and they stood there motionless and not talking during the day. They could hear the Nazis tear apart every Jewish home looking for Jews to meet their quota, stomping on the roofs and tearing them apart. In there, they had no food or water. That prominent family on the 3rd floor did bring them a sack of peas, a raw potato, and a few pieces of bread. And there was this boy named Plot. I think she said he was around 15 or so, 14 or 15 years old, very courageously went outside because they remembered this dish that had collected some rainwater. And he brought the dish of water back inside, and they passed the dish of rainwater around, and everyone took a sip. But when Rivka's father-in-law, when it was his turn to take a sip of water, he refused and said that he wanted the children to share his sip because he felt they had a better chance of surviving. My grandmother said that they could see through the blinds that the living ghetto was an inferno. People were crying and reciting the Shema, and the Dead Ghetto was completely exterminated, and then some Jews from the living ghetto also to meet their quota. My grandmother told me that the Germans were very, very precise and very organized. And once a quota was met for the day, there was not one more person was killed. And so the killing that occurred in my grandmother's hometown that I've been describing was done by a mobile killing group known as the Einsatzgruppen. And after 15 days, the pogrom had ended. Surviving the first pogrom, my grandmother said it was fate and not being able to return home from the field. My grandmother said they emerged with severe weakness and dehydration, and they immediately started looking around for anyone they knew. And she said that the Germans then began organizing the remaining 7,000 Jews. My grandmother's sister's father-in-law immediately succumbed to dehydration as soon as he emerged and died. My grandmother said there were no elderly or babies around, only the younger people that could work. And right at that same time, they created this Red School. It was created for the Jews to start sorting through the clothing of those that were murdered. And this is where my grandmother saw Rivka's sweater, the one I described with the intricate design. She saw her sweater and her grandmother Henya's jacket in this pile of clothing. And my grandmother told me that she didn't cry because she said they were the lucky ones. They were at peace and in heaven. And it was during this first pogrom that my grandmother's entire family died. The second ghetto was soon created, again, same as the first, with the living and dead ghettos based on profession. Here, my grandmother lived with 5 other girls in the Dead Ghetto. Even though she could knit, it wasn't considered, important enough. And so every day she did whatever work the Germans told her to do, but she was unfortunately stuck in the Dead Ghetto. One day, while she was at work, she cut her eyebrow on a window frame, and it caused a very significant bleed. And I think because of the blood, the Nazis permitted her to leave. Now, she knew a couple that lived in the living ghetto, and the woman asked my grandmother to come over since she knew my grandmother was hungry and she knew that my grandmother was not at work that day. So my grandmother went over to this couple's house in the living ghetto for the night. And 2 months after the first pogrom, the second one began, and that morning, the Dead Ghetto was completely extinguished within a few hours. During this pogrom, Rivka's in-laws all perished with the exception of Popa. And now there were just 1,000 Jews remaining, including my grandmother. My grandmother said that had she not spent the night with friends, she would have been captured and killed like her roommates. And again, it was fate. The new ghetto was created for the remaining 1,000 Jews. Only those with a trade were kept alive. And by trade, we're talking about tailors and shoemakers, candle makers, and you had to have a piece of paper in order to have life. She said, if you didn't have a piece of paper, you stayed in hiding. And unfortunately, my grandmother did not have a piece of paper, and so she remained in hiding. However, unfortunately for Mrs. Hirschhorn, a lovely woman, according to my grandmother, who had this piece of paper, she left the ghetto without the piece of paper and she was shot dead. Now, a candle maker, this is a little confusing, but a candle maker who knew my grandmother's father, Gershon, knew the widow, Mr. Hirschhorn, and he asked Mr. Hirschhorn if my grandmother could have his widow's piece of paper, to which he said yes. The piece of paper, I know it's very hard to read because it's a copy of a copy of a copy and so forth, but on the piece of paper, the birth date lists March of 1906. And as you might remember from the very beginning, I told you my grandmother was born in December of 1922. So that was quite a bit of an age difference. And especially, at this age, my grandmother was, a teenager, early 20s. So they very, very carefully changed the 0 from the 1906 to a 1 and to make it 1916. So it was closer to my grandmother's age. And my grandmother went by this birthday of March for the rest of her life. As just a quick aside, I remember when she was still alive, my kids and I would go visit her. Towards the last few years of her life, she lived in an assisted living facility, and, we'd come down the hallway with a bundle of sunflowers to remind her of her hometown. And my kids would yell, happy birthday, Bubby, happy birthday. And she would shush them. Nobody knows it's my birthday right now. It's quiet. And we'd have to celebrate quietly. And then, of course, if we went to visit her in March, we get in the elevator and it would list the residents' the March resident birthdays, and there was my grandmother's name, even though she was not born in March. But that is how a lot of survivors lived, always in fear that, there was a Nazi around the corner. And so she did assume this birthday for the rest of her life. And so anyways, back to her story. Now she lived in the ghetto. She lived in a working center, and she was one of 15 women that worked for the German soldiers, and she was knitting now. She was able to, that was, deemed useful at this time. She would knit stuff for the German soldiers and their girlfriends, and she indicated that life was very uneventful. She did go home and risk her life one last time. And she indicated that everything was gone but a heap of bricks, a few pots, one of her father's socks, and she saw her sister's slippers mounted on the fence. She saw the 3 cherry trees her father tended. The trunks, she said, were still painted white, and they stood and blossomed as if to announce that life will go on and on. She told me nature continues perpetuating its task. And the third pogrom was in December of 1943, exactly 1 year, 1 month, and 1 day after the second pogrom. And here the Germans were set to eliminate the final 1,000 surviving Jews. She told me she was getting ready for work when chaos ensued. The Nazis stormed into the ghetto, shooting everywhere. And my grandmother said people started running like scared mice, but there really was no place to hide. Everybody was out in the open and they knew who you were. But she ran with some others to a little outdoor deserted shed where they stood inside, pressed like sardines, and there was no ventilation. They were unable to move their arms or bodies. She estimated approximately 20 people packed inside, including Rivka's cousin, Popa. And they stood inside praying for their lives all day and all night, and until it became physically unbearable to continue standing. Also, it was the middle of the night. They stopped hearing the dogs barking. It sounded like the Nazis had gone home. And so quietly, 2 by 2, they ran out of the shed every 10 minutes. And prior to, my grandmother ran out with Popa, and prior to the ghettos, Popa's parents gave a woman named Janina Zawadzka some valuables in exchange for a hiding place should the need ever arise. My grandmother said that Janina was a lovely Polish woman who really pitied the Jews. And so my grandmother and Popa ran to her house at 3 a.m. and knocked on her door. She took them inside and hid them under some covers of a little bed in the house. But she was locking her door because she was hiding Jews, and the neighbors soon became very suspicious and asking her a lot of questions. Of course, back then, it's not like today where we lock our doors and windows and we set our alarm. Back then, all the doors were unlocked. And I just wanted to include a picture of Janina so you could see what she looked like. She and my grandmother engaged in a lot of correspondence, and this is just the back of a postcard that I found in my grandmother's photo album. I did submit her name to the Righteous Among the Nations with Yad Vashem, and I supposedly am supposed to hear back this winter, but that is what she looks like. And so with the neighbors becoming so suspicious, Janina moved the girls out to the outdoor stables in January. My grandmother said it was bitter cold and it smelled awful. But 2 months later, they left for the woods by wagon and offered, Janina gave them a bottle of vodka to bribe one of the German guards that they had to pass. And so in the woods is where they stayed for the remainder of their time until they were liberated. They found a family that needed some knitting done in exchange for some food, and so they did that. They met a Russian military representative who told them where the Russians were stationed, and so they were able to base their movement from that. They also knew that the Germans were not prepared for the very severe Russian winter, and they were suffering, and disillusionment was breaking the German army spirit. Defeat was becoming obvious, but also in the woods. But my Bubby and Popa met up with a group of young Jewish boys, Joseph and Moishe Lichtenstein. They were from the same hometown and knew of each other, but they did not know each other well. But the 4 of them became an instant new family. And my grandmother would tell me that if one of them found a potato, they would all share it equally. And they remained there in the woods until following the directions of the Russian dispatchers until they became liberated. And that's a picture of Joseph and Moishe Lichtenstein taken in 1946. And so once they were liberated, then they did, free themselves. They were elated, obviously, but they were met immediately with anti-Semitism and bitterness. The Russians really mistrusted everybody. They blamed the Jews on the war, and they would not allow them to register or settle. So the four of them were constantly on the move. This is a picture of my grandmother on the left and Popa on the right. I think it was taken around the mid-40s as well. So once their hometown was liberated, they went back to see if there was anywhere else, and they really had nowhere else to go. They didn't know if they would find any relatives. But my grandmother did find some photos. Some of the photos I've been able to show you today, they were on the ground covered with powder. Their house obviously was looted at some point. But while they were in their hometown, my grandmother married Joseph Lichtenstein, one of the boys, the one that was on the left, on October 15th of 1944. And so they went to Berlin. They'd considered going to Palestine since Israel was not born yet. But once they were in Berlin, they learned that the boats were rejected in Palestine. They did move to a displaced persons camp called Kibbutz Badarach. And you can see in that photograph, Joseph is in the middle. He's looking to his left or our right at my grandmother. She's the second from the right. But they really traveled from camp to camp looking for any relatives that might still be alive. My grandmother was born at the displaced persons camp in Berlin in July of 1946. And this is the cover of my book. You might recognize it. I actually had never seen this photo until right before my book was going to be published, while we were still finalizing the interior. I was going through the photo albums that my mother inherited after my grandmother passed away. And I absolutely love this photo. I love the cars on the back right that you can see. I love the feeling of just being at peace. You would never know that my grandmother had just survived what she did. And then, obviously seeing my mother now alive and holding her mother's hand as they walked down the street. Anyways, I love this photo so much. That's why it is on the cover of my book. So anyways, they ended up moving to Hamburg. And then they really didn't know where to go. My grandmother was absolutely going to leave Europe. She had no intention of staying in Europe. They had some friends that moved to Australia, so Australia became an option, and they had friends that moved to Montreal, so Montreal became an option. And that's really how they based where they were going to move to, where they knew some people. So they did hop on a boat for a 2-week voyage to Montreal in August of 1951. I know everyone always asks what happened to Popa. I don't know very much other than Popa moved to New York City. And then later in life, she moved to Florida. I believe she had 2 daughters. But this is a picture of them on the boat. My mom's on the far right. My grandmother's on the right behind my mother. And I believe that is Joseph in the middle drinking the coffee. And so after learning German, obviously, they moved to Montreal, where my grandmother then learned her 5th language, French. And in Montreal, my grandmother and Joseph, they had another daughter, my aunt. And very sadly, when my mother was 13 and my aunt was 3, Joseph passed away from leukemia. My aunt ended up moving, I get to that in a second. My mother then met my father in Montreal, and they had me, and I have 2 sisters. And my aunt moved to California for graduate school. And so really there was not much left in Montreal for my grandmother. This is a quick picture of us from 1971. My parents actually lived in Baltimore, Maryland for 1 year. And in that 1 year I was born, so I'm the only US born family member. But my grandmother really marveled at the idea that her very small family was growing. And so with my birth being the first grandchild, we were very close because of where we lived in Montreal and so forth. We lived in the same building, and I saw my grandmother every day. But this was just very, very moving for her. And so my parents moved to Arizona in 1978. We talked a little bit about the reasons why before we started the presentation. But then, as I mentioned, for the reasons already stated, in the 1980s, we moved my grandmother here. So she, obviously learned English. Having her very close to us, she lived in Scottsdale, really allowed my children to get to know her. And before she passed away, my grandmother had 5 granddaughters and 9 great-grandchildren. When I got married in 2002, she walked down the aisle with her brother-in-law, that is Mania Lichtenstein. He was quite a character, and I talk a little bit more about him in my book. He was on The Price is Right, a man full of life. You would never know that they experienced what they lived through. And that's my grandmother and me at my wedding in 2002. I like to just show a few pictures of my grandmother with my children at the, she lived at the Scottsdale Shadows, is it called? Oh, I think I'm saying the wrong thing. Scottsdale Springs. It's in just south of Old Town.
Yeah, it's the Springs.
Thank you, Springs. And then that's her with them just a year or two later. You could see they're all starting to get taller than her. She wasn't very tall. And so anyways, at 17 years of age, she was the sole survivor of her family. I just really always marveled at the fact that she was able to survive the way she did and build a new life as a refugee in several new countries, learning 6 different languages to survive. Although she was the sole survivor, she always carried with her the losses of her family and memories of the brutality that she witnessed and lived through. Her story is one of persistence, luck, and a bit of fate. She's known as saying I think I have it on a slide coming up. I'll wait for that. But my book, Living Among the Dead, really reminds us of the beautiful communities that existed before World War II, the lives lost and those that lived on, and the importance to never forget these stories so that history does not repeat itself. And this is the quote she said, "In my misfortune, I was very lucky." And so I just want to thank you all. I know it's almost 1:15. I hope I didn't speak too fast, but thank you. I want to thank you so much. I feel very honored and privileged when a group of people that don't know me want to spend your time with me, getting to know the story of my grandmother. And as I mentioned at the beginning, by way of a question, I was answering that my book is available on Amazon and really all major bookstores online. And I wanted to include my email address. Just remember that my first name ends with an A and my last name begins with an A. So if you go to my website, it's just adenaastrowsky.com, or my email, adena.astrowsky@yahoo.com. And if there's time, and I don't know everyone's schedule, but I'm happy to stay on. I'd love to answer any questions that you all might have.
Yes. First of all, just to repeat, I did put the email address and the website back into the chat.
Okay.
And if you do have a question, like Paul, I see you already unmuted, so you might as well go ahead, and then Morty will follow up with that.
I had a question. In your talk, you said in 1933, I think it was 33, you showed the schoolyard, and you said your grandmother already experienced anti-Semitism, that they would spit on them and they would throw things at them. If this was already beginning to be hot, why didn't her family think, let's get out of here now? Let's avoid this.
I asked my grandmother, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
I asked my grandmother that question many times, even I think my kids did. My grandmother said, first of all, the world was much larger to them than we think of it today, right? Things were so much more mobile. We have the internet, you're able to get information. It wasn't like that back then. They also never thought that the Nazi regime would be as destructive as they were. They never in a million years. In fact, in my book, I talk about a boy that came and was warning her town of what he witnessed or heard at a neighboring town, and they just didn't believe him. They never thought things would get so out of control. And so that's why they never left. My grandmother's father owned a pharmacy. They had a nice life. They knew all the neighbors, their friends, everyone they knew lived there. I mean, now, right, I have family in multiple countries, multiple states. Everyone they had was right there with them in the same town.
Thank you. Morty, you want to add something?
Where did you live in Montreal?
I lived in Dollar des Ormeaux.
Okay, because I'm in Montreal as we speak.
Oh my goodness. I have some first cousins that are there and that I'm very, very close with, actually.
I'm so sorry.
No, you don't need to be. I love them. But I was telling the group before we started, before I have twins, boy-girl twins that are 16, and I have a 14-year-old. And before the twins' B'nai Mitzvah, my husband and I took them to New York, showed them where he grew up, where he was born, all of that. And then we took them to Montreal and we showed them where I grew up and my school. And we stayed with my cousins and we had a great time. We went to the Orange Julep, which we've since educated everybody about that. And we went to St. Viator and had bagels and all of that. So anyways, that's where I'm originally from.
You tell the story so well.
Oh, thank
You
you.
know? Yashikoya for that.
Charlie, you had a question?
Yes. Matter of fact, my family name in Europe was Gershon also, but we were from Lithuania. And my family started getting out of there in the prior to the World War I. I mean, with the pogroms and all of the problems in Russia, they came to Texas. And as one brother, they started with the oldest brother coming over and him working and making money to send the next brother over. And that's how we got into this country.
Your family is very fortunate.
Yeah, thank goodness. I mean,
Yeah.
I finally got my grandmother over here after World War I. But it was quite a task. They lost several sisters during that war. The Germans came through Lithuania and just destroyed the whole area.
Yes.
Yeah, it was terrible. Family that's all they talked about, as I remember as a youngster.
Yeah. Well, your family's very lucky. My dad's father did come over also before the war, but my grandmother's wasn't as lucky.
Well, we were lucky. Yeah.
Thank you,
had
Charlie.
her and we were lucky, yeah.
Again, if there's anyone who has a question, please do feel free to use the chat or your mic. I see a question in the chat. Was your bubby in a concentration camp? If so, which one? My uncles were in Treblinka. That is from Ellen Tuckman.
Yes. My grandmother was not in a concentration camp. She was in labor camps, which is, I think, another reason why my book has been so popular. I mean, people always ask me, and I don't know, but these are some of the reasons I think, because there aren't as many books about the labor camps as there are about the concentration camps. But that is where she was, performing forced labor.
Interesting. Stan, you want to ask a question? Or Betty?
Because I always thought there were concentration camps. I didn't realize there were separate labor camps.
Right.
That she was in a labor camp.
Yes, exactly.
Lori,
I was wondering about the difference between the living and the dead ghettos. I had never known that there were two separate things, and it sounds like they actually went into the living ghetto, and your grandmother was lucky because she was in the dead ghetto at the time, or did I get that mixed up?
No, it is a little confusing because it flip-flopped a bit. So my grandmother's father was able to get a card listing him as a bricklayer, which gave him a skill or a trade that was valuable to the Nazis. So they allowed them to live in the living ghetto. You had to have a trade or be able to do something worthwhile for the Nazis. So their house was already situated in the living ghetto. But before the first pogrom, my grandmother was sent back from the wheat field to the Dead Ghetto. That ended up saving her life. Then before the second pogrom, she was in the Dead Ghetto, but the living ghetto was extinguished. So it flips and flops depending on what you're listed as. Do you have a trade? Do you have a card to prove it? Are you valuable to the Nazis or not? Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I muted a couple mics because I was getting some feedback. So if someone had a question that I muted, just unmute your mic. And then I had a question, actually. Now that you've sort of learned so much more about your grandmother, how has that affected you as an adult raising children?
Well, certainly, I think greatly it's affected my parenting greatly, but it's hard to always pinpoint what it is. I think there's definitely something to be said about keeping traditions. like the high holidays this past year, it would have been very easy for us to just have a regular evening and not do anything. The kids are teenagers, you know, they're anti everything as it is these days. But knowing what my grandmother lived through and how important keeping up with the culture and the traditions were to her, and just as a religion, you know, what we've gone through for hundreds of years, you know, I really made a concerted effort to zoom in into our family room, the services, and pay attention and sing along if we knew the rhythm and all of that. I try to light the candlesticks every Friday night for Shabbat. We're not very religious. I was raised in a conservative synagogue, but we've raised our children in a reform synagogue. But I think the idea is just to really have them understand their roots and what's important, and the traditions and the culture. Whatever my kids decide to do, you know, when they're adults will be their decision, but I want them to have knowledge and education, something to be able to make a decision from someday. But certainly we're very lucky that my grandmother lived to be 93 years old. I really thought she would have lived longer. She just got the pneumonia, and it was just sort of the beginning of the end. But because she lived so close to us and we would visit her often, at the assisted living facility at 2:00, they made cookies every day. And so we'd always try to get there around 2:15. My kids loved that. And it was just perfect because they'd come in, get some cookies, and then go see Bubby. But, you know, she always went out of her way for them. My aunt said that my children were like penicillin for her. If she had an ache, she'd forget all about it when she'd see my kids. And I'm, you know, very fortunate. My children were very interested in her and being with her and asking her questions. So it was really a two-way street. But certainly I think my closeness with her has evolved to their relationship when she was still alive, and being close with her as well. And hopefully they have that same sense of family and, you know, doing right among not just your family, but your friends and your community.
So, and then one follow-up to that, as a prosecutor, knowing, I guess, where decisions, for example, Nazi Germany and legislation and many other things that were involved in that led, and what it can lead to, does that play a role in how you view criminals and people who break certain laws, or does it not play a role?
I don't think it plays a role too much. I've attended a lot more webinars lately I just attended one last week. Ben Ferencz spoke, and he was the prosecutor for the Einsatzgruppen trials, you know, the biggest murder trial of the century, they say, or of all time, I forget. But, you know, in terms of being a prosecutor, we have ethical standards that we have to live by, or we have to work by. And I'm always, I never ever cross a line. I don't even try to get close to a line. I've gone out of my way if there's an argument to be made for why someone is not guilty, I will listen to that argument. I will do the research. I had a case not long ago that was a conviction. The man is serving life or close to it in prison. And an organization got involved thinking that he was maybe innocent. And we pulled up the evidence from over 20 years ago and went back through all of it. We sent in pieces of evidence to a lab back east for DNA testing. And it actually turned out that it is him. With even the more recent DNA testing that can be done, it proved that he actually was there, more than what they even had at trial. But I would never want to convict somebody of something that they did not do. But I also do believe that if you've done something that's wrong, against the laws, that you have a sentence, there's a consequence for that, right? We teach that to our children when they don't follow the rules of our house, that there's a consequence for your actions. And I feel the same way when it comes to the laws of our state and our country. If you're not following those laws and those rules, there's a consequence as well. And I feel strongly about that. And that's probably why I've been a prosecutor for my career, because, well, I think it's just a great job to have.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. Did you ever take the course or sit in on the What You Do Matters?
Yes.
Which you have? Okay. Yeah, we had a presentation for everyone here on that.
Yes,
So
I
that's
actually spoke with Sheila Polk. She's the county attorney up in
right
the
down the way.
and when they do a new train the trainer, she talked about bringing me in for that. But I'm so busy right now. I don't even know what that would involve. But
You
yeah,
would be perfect for it because you're not just, meaning we had it, I thought it was great. And I know that we got a lot of great feedback from everyone here who participated. But you have something that they don't have. I mean, you are a descendant of those terrible laws. So it's in
right,
you. You can speak differently or it's living.
right. Yeah, I did mention my interest, but well, right now with COVID and everything that's going on, I'm not sure how much training they're doing, but they know I'm interested. And if they can use me, I absolutely would make time for that.
Yeah, no, that's a pretty fascinating presentation.
Great.
Well, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions for Adena? Again, you can purchase that book on Amazon or you can go to her website, adenaastrowsky.com. And this was very informative. I loved learning more about your grandmother. This was, you pack it in a great way. Thank you.
Thank you. And you all should know that Rabbi helped translate one of my grandmother's passages that was in Yiddish. I think I mentioned at the very beginning, or maybe I didn't. So thank you for helping me with that because it's not easy to find a Yiddish translator these days.
Actually, I have my sister-in-law to thank for that as well, who helped with that. Who Ellen Tuckman is wishing she could do it for hers, but I just found out from my sister-in-law who's asking. I asked for help. No one can read it. It's illegible. So I guess it was also, I guess, your good fortune that the writing was legible. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
So Ellen, we're gonna try it again. If you bring the original, I'm gonna try to scan it myself.
You can also get help on Jewish Gen for translating any foreign language related
Nice.
to Jewish.
Is that, what do? You upload it there?
Yeah, by email.
Okay, so Ellen, we need to work on a good scan for you. She has some letters in Yiddish as well.
Oh yeah, that's a great idea. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really been my privilege and honor.
And thank
Thank
you.
you so much. It was wonderful. And I knew very little about any of it. So thank you so much for presenting it. And you did it so fascinating.
Thank you.